Big Shaq's mom stepped onto the elite range, where power wore polo shirts, and doubt came dressed as laughter. They mocked the code, the calm, the woman behind the legend. Then came the first shot, and silence hit harder than the bullet. No warm-up, no warning, just precision that made the room forget how to breathe. Because when Big Shaq's mom takes the shot, the world listens after the echo. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Granite Ridge wasn't the kind of place you stumbled into. Perched above the frost-laced slopes of Aspen, behind polished gates and a silence worth millions, it was more than just a shooting range. It was a curated club of power, the kind of place where last names echoed louder than gunshots, and skill was secondary to pedigree. It smelled of cigar smoke, lacquered wood, and unspoken rules. Every corner, every pane of glass whispered legacy, and every visitor understood one thing: outsiders weren't welcome, unless they were worth mocking. The air that morning had a bite to it, crisp and high-altitude clean. Snow lined the pines like sugar on velvet. The range's regulars, retired generals, corporate giants, trust fund hunters were already nestled in their routines, bantering in their curated camouflage and sipping spiced coffee with the relaxed entitlement of men who had never been challenged in ways that counted. Then came her. Lucille O'Neill walked through the entrance without hesitation, a guest pass folded neatly in her pocket. No entourage, no expensive gear bag, just a soft brown coat that looked too plain for the room, and a purse that might have belonged to someone's grandmother. She carried herself with grace, not defiance, like someone raised to respect space, not demand it. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, as if time bent politely around her. Heads turned, first in confusion, then in curiosity, and finally, in condescension. She wasn't just out of place. She was a contradiction. Elderly, black, plainly dressed, and standing dead center in a sanctum of wealth, whiteness, and weaponry. You could hear the discomfort in the quiet coughs, the raised brows. Nobody needed to say anything aloud. Their stares did the heavy lifting. Someone near the concierge whispered, "Is she lost?" Another chuckled, "Maybe she thinks this is the Lodge Cafe." Lucille took none of it in. Or rather, she did, but didn't register it the way they expected. She wasn't new to cold rooms or tight-lipped rooms. She'd raised a giant in them, raised him with both hands, and prayer, raised him to understand that love is armor and grace is a weapon. Shaquille may have grown into Big Shaq, a global name etched on courts and screens, but Lucille had always been the anchor beneath the tide. His mother, yes, but also his first coach, his first defender, and his quietest strength. Today she was alone, but she didn't walk like it. At the registration desk, a polished young man greeted her with a tight, rehearsed smile, the kind you give someone you're not sure you should be serving. His eyes flicked to the guest pass, then back to her face with subtle disbelief. "Welcome to Granite Ridge," he said, slow, cautious. "You, know how things work here?"
Lucille nodded.
She said little. There was no need to validate the question. Her silence wasn't ignorance. It was choice. And that choice rippled through the range like a pebble in a still lake. Behind her, someone else watched with particular interest. Carter Langston, Olympic gold medalist, poster boy of precision, a man born into the exact kind of lineage this place worshipped. He lounged near the east glass, rifle propped on his shoulder like it weighed nothing. Smile curled at the edges. Carter wasn't just Granite Ridge's golden son. He was its myth in motion. Flawless aim, flawless jawline, and a reputation for breaking both records and egos. He was the range's peacock and its predator, and he'd just found someone he considered He leaned over to a colleague. "I'll give her 5 minutes before she leaves." But Lucille didn't leave. She walked toward the observation deck, her eyes sweeping the shooting stations, like she was searching for something she already knew would be there. She paused at lane 6, empty, clean, facing the icy expanse of the back ridge, the farthest target lane, the kind no beginner dared start with. Then she sat. No fanfare, no stretching. She just breathed deep and slow, like the moment was settling into her, not the other way around. Around her, the whispers grew louder. The range fed off spectacle, and this felt like the beginning of one. A woman like her, here, alone, with nothing but a guest pass and the poise of a statue. Carter couldn't help himself. He crossed the room like he owned it, which, in some unspoken way, he did, and when he reached her station, he stopped just behind her. hands loose at his sides, wearing that grin that often came before a takedown. "Need a hand, ma'am?" he asked, voice dipped in false chivalry. Lucille turned to him slowly. Her face gave nothing away. Then, with the faintest trace of a smile, she shook her head once, measured and unbothered. Carter chuckled. It was the kind of laugh that played to the crowd more than the moment. "All right then," he said, raising both brows. "Care for a little challenge?" Silence. Carter continued, now louder enough for others to hear. "One shot, 50 yards. You hit bullseye. I'll donate 10 grand to any charity you want. You miss, we call it even and no harm done." The range perked up. Cameras lifted. Phones emerged like drawn blades. Lucille stood, stepping to the line like a memory brushing against time. She picked up the rifle, his rifle she hadn't brought one, and checked the sight with a quiet precision that made one or two people exchange glances. Then she raised it, and for a moment, everything held still. No wind, no shuffle. Even Carter stopped smiling. She fired. The round cracked through the air like a sentence with no pause, and a half-second later, bulls, clean, undeniable, centered like a whispered truth. The shot echoed longer than usual, not because of the sound, but because no one knew what to say after it ended. Carter's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Lucille placed the rifle down gently, adjusted her coat, and stepped back without a single glance at the target. Behind her, the entire room had changed temperature. Granite Ridge had just witnessed something it didn't have a category for. And in that silence, a story had begun. A quiet, cold, blistering kind of story. The kind that doesn't ask permission to be told. At Granite Ridge, the rules weren't written, they were inherited. They hung in the air like old money and aged whiskey, understood without being spoken. Every glance was a measure, every smirk a verdict. When Lucille O'Neill first stepped past the glass doors, her presence didn't just shift the atmosphere, it disrupted the ritual. She carried a simple folded guest pass in her hand, its paper crisp and official. But in that world of handcrafted leather cases and platinum memberships, it looked almost insulting. It was a key, but not the kind this place respected. She didn't try to blend in. Lucille wasn't the type to apologize for her place in the world. Yet the moment she stepped further into the hall, whispers started surfacing like steam off cold stone. Not hostile, yet, just uncertain. Curious in that way privilege often is, when it doesn't immediately recognize the worth of what it sees. She's someone's housekeeper. No, maybe somebody's aunt? She's Shaq's mom, I think. Someone muttered, followed by a scoff. Yeah. Sure. Next you'll say Oprah's her tennis partner. There it was. The assumption that someone like her couldn't be someone. Lucille remained unshaken. She moved with an elegance that didn't announce itself. The kind of poise built from surviving more than her fair share of being underestimated. Her steps were unhurried, her focus forward. She had seen faces like these before, in boardrooms, at fundraisers, even behind pulpits. Polished, performative, polite, until threatened. Today she wasn't here for them. But as fate would have it, they were about to become part of a moment they'd never forget. Among the crowd stood Carter Langston, half drunk on his own celebrity, radiating the kind of charisma that came from decades of being told he was exceptional. Tall, photogenic, dead-eyed in the way ego tends to dim real sight. Carter wasn't just a competitive shooter, he was a brand. Granite Ridge had become part of his myth. Every championship photo on the range's lobby wall had his grin, his gear, his victories stamped across it like a watermark of class. He watched Lucille the way a lion might watch a rabbit wandering too close to the den. Not with fear, with amusement. He leaned back against the polished oak bar, twirling a .22 bullet between his fingers like it was a coin, eyes never leaving her. The moment she walked toward the far end of the firing lanes, specifically Lane 6, Carter smirked. Lane 6 was notoriously difficult. Long distance, angled wind, minimal cover, the range's pride. Most beginners didn't even glance at it. Lucille didn't hesitate. That, more than anything, pricked Carter's pride. He stepped forward. Not dramatically, not rudely, just with enough casual confidence to be watched. The range's conversations began to dwindle. People leaned slightly closer, the scene was forming, and Carter, always attuned to a stage, knew exactly how to shape it. He approached her with a showman's flair, and the practiced ease of a man who knew how to turn mockery into sport. "Afternoon," he said, his voice warm but coated in something slicker beneath the surface. "New around here?" Lucille turned, barely tilting her head. I don't believe we've met, he continued, louder now, projecting for the crowd. Carter Langston, Olympic shooter, resident record holder. This is usually my lane, but I don't mind sharing. Lucille didn't speak. She simply placed her guest pass down on the bench beside her. Her fingers were steady. She adjusted her coat, eyes focused on the distant target, as if the wind itself was telling her something only she could hear. Carter chuckled. Tell you what, he said, stepping to her side. Let's make this fun. He raised a hand theatrically, turning to address the curious onlookers, now gathering behind them. One shot. 50 yards. Her shot. If she nails the bullseye, I'll write a check. $10,000. To any charity she wants. If she misses, no big deal. Just a friendly warm-up. It wasn't generosity. It was theater. The kind of bet meant to entertain the bored rich and remind everyone who really ran the ridge. Lucille didn't nod, didn't flinch, didn't question the terms. She just stepped to the firing line, picked up the rifle he offered, and turned to face the range. Her hands moved slowly. Not with hesitation, but with care. She examined the weapon, not out of unfamiliarity, but as someone reacquainting themselves with an old rhythm. Her movements carried weight, memory, and something more. Something grounded in decades of being told when she could and could not speak, stand, or aim. Behind her, Carter leaned on a railing, relaxed, arms crossed. He glanced at his watch, smirking as someone whispered, "This is gonna be quick." Lucille lifted the rifle. It wasn't her rifle, but she held it like it knew her name. The wood pressed into her shoulder like it belonged there. She looked through the scope once, then again, not adjusting, just calibrating. Her breath slowed. The world for her narrowed. The wind stilled. The onlookers hushed. Then crack. The shot rang out like a verdict. A moment passed. And then, through the high-powered optics and mounted monitors, the proof blinked into view. Bullseye. Dead center. Not close. Not barely. Perfect. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Even Carter blinked. Processing. The crowd behind them leaned in, some standing on tiptoe, confirming what the screen clearly showed. No mistake. No glitch, just a single perfect shot, fired by the woman. None of them thought could hit it. Carter's smirk faltered, then returned, forced this time pinched at the edges. Well now, he said with an empty laugh. Guess I'm out 10 grand. But no one was laughing. Not anymore. Lucille didn't look at him. She didn't look at the crowd. She simply set the rifle down with quiet care, turned and walked away from the lane as if she hadn't just rewritten the room's rules with one motion. Her shoulders never dropped. Her pace never changed. She didn't need their applause. She'd never needed it, because what she carried inside was older than their trophies, deeper than their heritage. It was the unshakable power of someone who had been through fire, and chose not to burn, but to refine. The moment became lore before it was over. Phones had captured it. Whisper networks ignited. The staff at the desk, once dismissive, now exchanged nervous looks, and Carter, standing beneath a banner bearing his own image, felt something shift beneath him. Not fear, but the first edge of something worse. Doubt. And for Lucille O'Neill, mother of Big Shaq, it was just beginning. The echoes of Lucille's bullseye still clung to the frostbitten walls of Granite Ridge, like an aftershock. Silence had filled the space where smirks once lived, where laughter had flowed freely before being frozen mid-breath. That one shot had traveled further than 50 yards. It had torn through the self-importance of a room filled with men who prided themselves on lineage, not legacy. And standing in the center of it all, with her quiet coat and unshaken hands, Lucille O'Neill had done what no rifle ever could. She had disarmed a fortress with stillness. Carter Langston stood frozen near the monitors, his features locked somewhere between amusement and disbelief. His smile remained, but now it curled with a subtle crack, like porcelain under pressure. He chuckled, but it came late. Half beat off, a reflex born of habit, not confidence. The kind of laugh that tries to summon back the control slipping through its fingers. Around him, whispers grew like vines, crawling up the walls, across the velvet seats, around the boot heels of legacy shooters who suddenly didn't know where to place their pride. He knew this crowd, knew what they needed to shift their loyalty, their attention, spectacle, escalation, domination. So Carter did what men like him have always done. When their power feels questioned, not countered with grace, but threatened with proof. He raised his voice again, this time sharper, pulling every gaze back to him. All right. he said, louder now, clapping his hands once like the master of ceremonies at his own redemption. Seems I underestimated you. He paced slowly, deliberately, letting the pause drag just enough to reclaim the stage. Let's raise the stakes, shall we? The crowd buzzed with interest again, an electric hum of entitlement, hungry for a new twist. Carter turned toward Lucille, now seated again on the edge of the bench at lane 6, unbothered, unmoved, her eyes not on him but on the ridgeline beyond the targets, like she was reading the sky instead of his ego. 3 shots, he declared, 75 yards this time. My custom rifle. $50,000, says you can't land all 3 in the red. Not just a bullseye now. Precision. Grouping. You're good. Sure, but are you consistent? A low murmur rippled through the room. This was no longer just posturing. It was a gamble that tasted of desperation cloaked as bravado. Lucille said nothing for a moment. Her hands remained in her lap, fingers interlaced calmly. Then she stood. No drama, no hesitation. She stepped back toward the line, her gait unhurried but steady, and gave the faintest nod. She didn't glance at Carter. She didn't address the crowd. There was no statement, no witty comeback. Just that nod. And the silence that followed it was its own kind of speech. Carter gestured toward the staff, who fetched his custom sniper rifle, a slick, polished piece of engineering that had his initials engraved along the scope and trigger guard. It gleamed in the filtered sunlight like a trophy born to serve him. He handed it to Lucille like a man handing over something sacred. Though the smirk had returned to his lips as if to say, "This will correct the imbalance." She took it without fanfare. The target was farther this time. Smaller in appearance, the wind stronger, angled off the pine-heavy slope to the left. Carter knew this shot well. He had practiced it in every season, in every weather, until the rifle was practically an extension of his hand. What he hadn't expected was how Lucille handled it. Not with the energy of someone rising to a challenge, but someone answering a calling. Her stance shifted. Her breath slowed. Her right hand wrapped around the grip with memory, rather than calculation. She didn't check the scope twice. She didn't blink. The first shot rang out. Hit. Dead in the red. A rustle in the audience, not loud enough to be called a gasp, but audible enough to mark tension. The second shot. Hit. Slightly higher, but within the cluster. And then the third. She held the rifle longer this time. Not for effect, but for rhythm. Like the shot was already fired inside her, and her fingers simply followed the echo. Hit. Almost overlapping the first. The cluster on the monitor was near perfect, the grouping tighter than any recreational shooter had ever managed at this range. Not a fluke, not luck, mastery. The silence this time was cavernous. Carter didn't speak. He didn't move. His custom rifle, now resting on the bench beside Lucille, looked less like a trophy and more like a confession. Someone in the crowd exhaled, loud enough to be heard. Another murmured something about recalibrating scopes. But there was no noise, no laughter, no recovery. Lucille stepped away again, this time heading not back to her seat, but toward the front desk, where a modest clipboard still held the paperwork tied to the guest pass. She took a pen from the counter and scribbled something down. Then she turned to a woman nearby, one of the staff who had kept her distance before, and handed the clipboard to her. No speech, no smile. Then she turned to leave. One of the organizers caught up with her before she reached the exit, flustered and overwhelmed. He asked where she wanted the prize money sent, as if unsure she truly believed she'd earned it. Lucille paused for the first time. She said quietly, but firmly, "The Elijah Ward Foundation, for disabled veterans. Send it there." Then she walked out. It took a few seconds before the name landed across the room. Elijah Ward, a decorated war vet, Purple Heart recipient, and late husband of Lucille O'Neill, a man who'd trained her to shoot not for show but for safety, not to prove, but to protect. The emotion that followed wasn't applause, it was reverence. Back inside, Carter remained near the monitor, jaw tight. The confidence that once danced in his eyes was replaced by calculation. He wasn't done, not by a long shot, but something in him had shifted. That morning, he'd invited her in for sport. Now, she'd sent him back to the drawing board. As the crowd began to disperse, some with murmurs of admiration, others with discomforted silence, one truth remained. Granite Ridge had just been shaken. Not by scandal, not by sabotage, but by a woman who refused to posture, refused to explain, and refused to be predictable. Lucille didn't arrive to be remembered, but she left with a silence that spoke louder than any name ever etched into the range's walls. And behind that silence, a storm was building. Because some reputations are made in battle. But legends? They're made in restraint. Snow fell with a hush that morning in Atlanta, softening the sharp edges of the world. Lucille O'Neill sat at the old oak kitchen table that had survived decades of conversation, loss, love, and silence. In front of her, beneath the gentle glow of an overhead pendant lamp, was a black and white photograph. Elijah Ward O'Neill, her husband, a man with fire in his chest and patience in his hands. He'd worn the uniform with quiet pride, served with honor, and come home with stories he rarely told, but which echoed in every creak of the house they built together. Lucille ran her fingers along the edges of the photo. It wasn't nostalgia. It was grounding. Elijah had been gone for nearly 20 years. Taken too early, but he hadn't left her alone. Not really. He was in the wood of the table, the rhythm of the wind chimes on the back porch, and in the steady beat of her hands when she picked up a weapon. It was Elijah who taught her to shoot, not for war but for presence, not to harm but to honor. That stillness shattered when her phone buzzed beside the plate of peeled apples she hadn't touched. The screen glared with headlines. Carter Langston issues open challenge, multi-discipline rematch at Granite Ridge. Lucille didn't react right away. She read the headline again, letting the words sink deep like a stone into a river. The article was already spreading, televised, corporate-sponsored, audience-backed. A calculated event built not around sport, but around narrative, a chance to reclaim control, restore an ego bruised on camera, and spin a new myth. But the terms weren't fair. They weren't meant to be. Every element, every distance, every tool, every environmental variable, was curated to showcase Carter's prowess and minimize hers. She wouldn't just be stepping into a rematch. She'd be walking into a trap disguised as competition. But Lucille didn't blink. She rose from the table without a word, walked to the back room, and opened a closet filled not with rifles or trophies, but memory. Inside were things not worn for ceremony, but for function. Her husband's old fatigues, his range boots, the worn-out journal he'd carried across 2 continents. Tucked inside its back cover were maps, names, coordinates, and among them, a note she remembered well. In Elijah's handwriting, "If you ever need to find stillness, go here." The woods north of Jasper, Georgia. Unmarked, untamed, and sacred to those who had known real battle. That's where she went. No press, no fanfare, no camera waiting at the trailhead. Just her and a duffel bag packed not with weapons but with intent. The air out there was different. Heavier with memory, lighter with distraction. Pines towered above like quiet sentinels. The ground was uneven, but familiar. Lucille made her camp beneath a deadfall tree, pitched a tarp the way Elijah had taught her. Tight, clean, wind-proof. And then before dawn each morning, she trained, but not alone. Word had spread faster than she anticipated. But in the right corners, circles of people who didn't need social media to know what mattered. Veterans who had served with Elijah began to arrive one by one. Some she recognized, others only knew her by name. They didn't bring cameras or questions, they brought resolve. These were not men and women sculpted by gyms or trainers. They weren't built for aesthetics. They were carved by reality, by years of discipline, discomfort and duty. Each of them had scars, some visible, others buried so deep even language couldn't reach them. They trained not for gold but for grounding. Their presence wasn't flashy. It was reverent. Lucille joined them at dawn. Drills began in silence. They shot at distances meant to intimidate. Not on level ground, but across ridges, through fog, around blind corners. She learned not to listen for the shot, but for the breath before it. Not to look at the target, but to feel it. They practiced stances, pressure, draw speed, sight alignment, reload drills, and when the weapons were holstered, they sat by fires and spoke in pieces, not of war but of healing. They taught her how to read a variable wind without technology, how to trust the weight of her own hand, how to make decisions under duress, not from instinct, but from centered clarity. Lucille took notes. Not on paper, but in the rhythm of her body. Her age became her edge. She wasn't rushing like the young. She wasn't trying to win approval. She was moving with purpose, measured, unrelenting. Every bruise, every sore muscle was a message from the past, reminding her that this wasn't about Carter. It never had been. It was about the space women like her weren't allowed to take up, and the stories they were never supposed to shape. Meanwhile, in Aspen, Carter rehearsed in a different kind of arena. Private facilities, cutting-edge tech, simulated ranges. He was surrounded by coaches, media handlers, and marketing strategists. His name was back in the news. His grin on the posters, the promos, the build-up packages. The world was watching again, and he was counting on it. He didn't know what Lucille was doing. Not really. His team tracked media, not movement, and Lucille gave them nothing. No press releases, no interviews, just silence. It made the analysts uneasy. The sponsors called it mystique. Carter called it irrelevant. But every night somewhere beneath the Georgia canopy, a different preparation was taking place. One not bound by performance, but by legacy. There was a moment, 2 weeks before the rematch, when Lucille sat alone at the ridge's edge, eyes scanning the low tree line. She held her breath for a moment, not out of stress but out of reverence. In her lap was Elijah's journal, now filled with added scribbles in her own hand. Range notes, adjustment sketches, new ways to visualize pressure. Behind her, an old friend of Elijah's approached. Marcus Boone, a quiet man with steel gray eyes and a limp from a mine detonation. He sat beside her without asking. "You ready?" he asked after a while. Lucille didn't answer immediately. She closed the journal and stared out at the falling dusk. "I'm not going to prove I belong," she said finally. "I'm going to remind them I never left." He nodded once, slow and deep. "Then you're ready." The last week was precision. No more practice, just rhythm. She spent the final days walking trails, shooting one bullet at a time, each round carrying a breath, a memory, a name. When she cleaned her weapons at night, she didn't think of Carter. She thought of the women who had taught her patience, the soldiers who'd fought invisibly, the mothers who had shaped giants and never made headlines. Her son had broken backboards, but now she was about to break silence. The final morning, as she packed her gear into a single leather case worn by time, one of the younger veterans who'd joined her pulled her aside. "They're going to throw everything at you," the woman said. "Pressure, noise, cameras, everything they think will shake you." Lucille smiled. "Let them." And with that, she stepped out of the woods and into the storm. What began as a flicker now roared like wildfire through the glossy corridors of media houses and the buzzing corners of social feeds. Lucille O'Neill was returning to Granite Ridge, not as a curiosity this time, but as a name worth knowing, a story worth chasing. Her first appearance had been an anomaly, her second a disruption. Now, with the rematch looming on every broadcast and the countdown crawling across primetime graphics, she was becoming something altogether rarer, a legend in real time. And legends, especially the ones that don't ask for the spotlight, make the world pay attention in uneasy silence. Within days, Granite Ridge was booked out. The waiting list swelled with reporters, lifestyle influencers, combat veterans, and camera crews eager to document what they couldn't explain. The narrative had turned. What Carter Langston had planned as a redemption arc was being hijacked by something more interesting. Lucille's refusal to be cornered by genre. She wasn't the underdog, because she'd never asked for odds. She wasn't the villain, because she refused to fight dirty. She was the anomaly that made the algorithm twitch. Carter, once perfectly comfortable in the glow of his curated fame, began to unravel beneath it. What had once been a playful challenge had mutated into a reputational wildfire. People were no longer tuning in to watch him win. They were watching to see if he'd crack. It started with small things: longer practice hours, obsessive recalibration of gear, overridden advice from his team. Sponsors who once hung on his every word now watched the data quietly. Trends were shifting, comments skewing, engagement flattening. The man who had controlled every narrative now found himself chasing one he couldn't catch. And so Carter turned to the only thing men like him have always turned to when power feels threatened: information. He hired a private team to dig, not just into Lucille's past, but into her life. Family, finances, friends, education history, social affiliations, church records. He combed through public speeches, alumni registries, property records. The goal wasn't discovery. The goal was disruption. If he could find a crack, just one, he could push it open, plant doubt, reclaim the upper hand. But what came back was maddening. Nothing. No scandals. No financial skeletons. No court cases. No lawsuits. No political outbursts. Her background was not just clean, It was quietly revered. Lucille O'Neal's name surfaced across community boards and education panels, veterans programs, nonprofit initiatives, not flashy but foundational. People who spoke of her did so with calm respect, the kind reserved for those who don't chase applause but earn legacy. Even the trail of her son, Shaquille, massive, magnetic and unmistakable, didn't overshadow her. If anything, it magnified the quiet dignity she'd built on her own terms. And that was the most unsettling part of all. Lucille didn't need Shaq, but he never let go of her. While the world speculated about his involvement, Shaquille O'Neal remained deliberately silent. There were no press conferences, no Instagram posts, no sound bites dressed as support. He didn't show up courtside or issue a well-timed tweet. He stayed in the wings, but not absent. Insiders spotted him attending late-night meetings with her trainers, providing discreet financial support to the Honor and Resilience Range project, and privately calling veterans to thank them for working with her. To most it seemed like distance. To those who knew, it was devotion. Because Shaq knew what was coming wasn't about him. He had built his legacy in arenas where noise was currency. But this wasn't that. This wasn't a slam dunk or a commercial comeback. This was an arena of silence, of breath control, of calculation. And in this arena, his mother didn't need a hype man. She needed space. Carter, meanwhile, took the lack of public response as a green light to intensify his narrative. He started leaking training footage, staged clips of high-precision drills, sweating late-night sessions, testimonials from former teammates hyping his renewed edge. The captions told a story of a warrior reawakening, a titan reclaiming his throne. His PR team arranged interviews with lifestyle magazines, segments on morning talk shows, countdown segments, with animated breakdowns of his gear. He wore his medals more prominently now. He spoke less about Lucille's skill and more about his own redemption. And yet, the numbers didn't respond. Something was off. The viewership wasn't leaning into his comeback. They were waiting for hers. Somewhere in Atlanta, Lucille remained unreachable. When reporters came to her house, she didn't answer the door. When journalists called, her phone stayed silent. Her only public act in the days before the match was a visit to a small shelter on the west side, where she dropped off fresh clothes and spoke quietly to a room of mothers rebuilding their lives. A staffer snapped a photo. It surfaced online without hashtags, and still it went viral. There was no fight in her silence. No passive aggression. Just resolve. And that resolve did something Carter's team hadn't prepared for. It made people trust her. Not root for her. Not idolize her. Trust her. That trust transformed the rematch from a competition into a referendum. Not on skill, but on values. Not on tradition, but on access. She wasn't just showing up to shoot. She was showing up to remind the world what dignity looked like when it didn't need a platform. And the more Carter flailed for control, the clearer that became. In a final attempt to tip the scale, Carter's team proposed a last-minute adjustment to the event. More stations, added pressure, unpredictable range variables. A new stage built into the side of the ridge, designed for televised effect. A new set of sponsor-driven tests, including thermal imaging, stress testing, and endurance components. The language of the proposal was diplomatic. The intent was surgical. Lucille received the update and issued no response. But those around her adjusted accordingly. In the woods of Georgia, new drills emerged. She trained in the rain. She fired after being woken from shallow sleep. She adjusted her gear in darkness, practiced movement in low visibility. Her team simulated crowd noise, flashing lights, camera interference. They didn't coach her. They challenged her, because they knew Carter was building a cage, and they were teaching her how to outgrow it. The day before the match, Lucille did one final session alone. At dawn, with fog still clinging to the roots, she stepped into the clearing near a forgotten stone wall. At the edge of the woods, she laid out a single target and loaded 5 rounds. No cameras, no metrics, just breath and memory. The first shot missed wide. She didn't curse or adjust. She simply waited, then fired again. Closer. Another breath. Third shot dead center. She holstered her weapon, picked up the spent casings, and whispered something into the trees. Not a prayer, a promise. That night, in a rented cabin tucked against the tray line, she ironed her jacket and packed her case. Inside it were the same tools Carter would carry. Firearms, optics, cleaning kits. But there was something else he wouldn't have. A folded letter from Shaq. It had only one line. "Do what you've always done, Mama. Change the story." And with that she closed the case. The stage was set. The world was watching. But Lucille wasn't walking in for their attention. She was walking in for truth. It came like a storm. Not the kind that sneaks in from the horizon, but the kind that's been brewing for days, teased in flashes and static, until the sky finally splits open. The Carter Langston Invitational was no ordinary event. It was a televised machine, an industrial-grade showcase polished for prestige and spectacle. The range, usually cold and exclusive, had been transformed into something louder, grander, almost theatrical. Sponsor banners snapped in the wind, drone cameras hovered like vultures, and massive LED screens projected Carter's face on loop, beside curated clips of his past victories. This was his battlefield. His design. His redemption narrative wrapped in high production value. And then, Lucille O'Neill arrived. No convoy, no entourage, just a rented black sedan that parked at the far end of the lot. She stepped out wearing the same brown coat she'd worn weeks ago, the one social media had memorized. In her hand, a leather case. Not flashy, not branded, just worn, stitched with care, and silent in its statement. When she walked through the entry gates, the crowd, thousands strong, seated in temporary bleachers and flanked by broadcast crews, noticed the absence of fanfare. No anthem, no spotlight, just a presence. Carter was already inside, stationed at the warm-up zone with his technicians and trainers. He wore a deep navy shooting jacket with gold accents and the Olympic crest sewn into the shoulder. Everything about him was precise. Hair, stance, even the tone of his grip on the rifle. When Lucille entered the prep area, Carter's eyes followed her like a calculation he couldn't finish. She didn't look at him, not out of defiance, but detachment. She hadn't come to answer him. She'd come to complete something. The event began with formality. A moment of silence, a playing of national colors, a brief nod to the veterans in attendance. And then, like clockwork, the structure unfolded. 10 stations, each designed to test a specific discipline. Pistol, revolver, pump-action shotgun, AR long-range carbine, dynamic movement rifle, urban tactical course, rapid response test, precision marksmanship, and the final long-range sniper challenge. Carter, per competition order, led at each station. He moved with efficiency, his body remembering motions. His mind had rehearsed for weeks. He landed clean hits, controlled breathing, fast reloads. The crowd cheered dutifully, but the noise carried something strained beneath it. A growing recognition that the man they'd come to see dominate was somehow performing like he was watching something else. Because Lucille was not competing. She was composing. At every station, she moved like a whisper across a drum, deliberate, light, unsettling in its calm. Her pistol stance didn't snap. It flowed. Each trigger pull sounded like punctuation in a conversation only she could hear. Shotgun slugs ripped through targets with the force of experience, not speed. Her movements were tighter than Carter's, less showy, more economic. She didn't look toward the screens, didn't soak in applause. At the AR-15 course, where competitors usually fought recoil with aggressive posture, Lucille's form didn't resist the weapon. She worked with it. By Station 6, murmurs began spreading across the bleachers. The betting boards, previously flooded with confident wagers on Carter, started to shift. Not entirely, but the numbers were tilting. Journalists leaned forward, whispering hurried notes into their recorders. One of the broadcasters removed his earpiece to confirm scoring data. Because it wasn't just that she was accurate, it was that she was unshakably so. By Station 8, Carter's composure had begun to strain. His rounds landed, yes, but not with the finesse that made him famous. His breath began to shallow, his reloads lagged by milliseconds, his sight checks lengthened. He checked the monitors after every sequence, not to celebrate, but to compare. Lucille never looked once. Then came Station 9, the Precision Marksmanship Challenge. Targets designed to simulate wind drift, distance shift, and timing pressure. Here, most competitors adjusted scopes between rounds, double-checked crosswinds, recalibrated grip tension. Carter did all of that, and still missed one target slightly off-center. His jaw clenched as the judges marked the red dot, just shy of the scoring threshold. Lucille took the rifle, eyes already softened into focus. She didn't adjust the sight, she didn't even blink twice. 5 rounds, 5 targets, 5 centers. Like each bullet had been given a purpose before the trigger was ever pulled. And then, the final test. Station 10. The long-range sniper rig. Carter's personal weapon. His Macmillan TAC-338. Customized to the edge of legality. The very same one his technician had tampered with hours before. Adjusted scope deviation. Slight misalignment. Enough to disorient even a seasoned shooter. Just enough to make Lucille's form stumble, without obvious error. She stepped forward and took the rifle. Her hands paused. She felt the imbalance immediately. Not just in weight, but in resistance. The scope pull was tighter. The bolt reset delayed. She recognized it, not as sabotage in name, but as intent. She didn't speak. She didn't step back. She simply inhaled through her nose, shifted her heel an inch left, and accepted the burden without complaint. 10 rounds. She set herself. The world seemed to pause. First shot. Center. Second. Slight deviation corrected instantly. Third, fourth, fifth. Tight cluster uniform as breath. By the sixth, the crowd had gone completely silent. No murmurs. No clicks. Even the camera drones stilled in place, holding their flight patterns like worshippers before an altar. Carter stood near the monitor. Lips pressed into a line. Seventh. Center. Eighth. Center. She paused slightly before the ninth. Closed her eyes for a second. Ninth. Dead center. Final round. Her finger rested on the trigger, not trembling, just waiting. Then, as if some unseen signal passed between the earth and her bones, she pulled. 10th shot. Perfect. The monitor flashed with the tightest cluster of the competition. Every bullet within a margin so slim it looked fabricated. The crowd didn't cheer. Not right away. They stood. Not because someone told them to. Not because the camera panned toward them, but because something in the air had shifted so profoundly that sitting felt disrespectful. And Carter? He didn't speak. He didn't protest. He stared at the screen, like it was delivering a truth he'd never believed he'd have to read. Lucille stepped back from the rifle, set it down, and looked straight ahead. Not at Carter, not at the cameras, but at the tree line beyond the range, where wind whispered between the pine needles. She nodded once.
Not to anyone.
Just to the moment. The stillness that followed wasn't shock. It was acknowledgement. But this wasn't about winning. It was about witnessing. And in that final stand, Lucille O'Neill did not raise her voice, did not clench her fists, did not offer a single boast. She just aimed, and made every shot speak. The echoes of the final shot still clung to the air like a held breath, one the crowd didn't know how to release. Lucille had stepped back from the sniper's platform with the same steady gait she'd arrived with, silent, unhurried, untouched by the chaos she'd just caused. The monitors still displayed the perfect cluster. 10 bullets. 10 centers. In a rigged scenario using a rifle meant to disorient her. But Lucille had made it look like scripture, like the rifle had simply remembered who taught it purpose. The officials paused, exchanged hushed words, double-checked scoring systems, and bullet groupings. Everything checked out. Every round accounted for. No mechanical failures. No anomalies in the fire sequence. And yet, there was something odd. A slight delay in bolt reset on the custom rifle. A technician noticed it first, then flagged it. A second specialist confirmed. Something in the scope's calibration had been altered. Deliberately, and very recently. Quiet alarm bells rang. The judges requested footage. Not from the live broadcast, but from the range's internal systems. The ones installed for liability protection, not for show. It didn't take long. The footage showed one of Carter's own tech team members accessing the rifle station the night before, adjusting the optics, and running unauthorized recalibration cycles. The timestamps were damning. The tampering wasn't subtle. It was strategic. And now it was public. Carter's demand for a scoring review turned into his own unintentional confession. Within minutes, the whispers began. From the bleachers to the media tent, across the marble lobby and into the executive suites upstairs, murmurs hardened into headlines. Sabotage confirmed in Langston's camp. Lucille O'Neill's calm under fire becomes moment of the year.
Granite Ridge faces crisis of integrity.
The PR team around Carter scrambled. Press agents begged for a hold on footage release. But it was too late. Clips had already leaked. One showed Carter's technician entering the rifle room alone. Another showed Lucille noticing the altered weight and choosing to shoot anyway. The internet, as always, had already formed its verdict before the official statements landed. Sponsorships disappeared like smoke. A major sportswear brand dropped Carter within hours, followed by 2 equipment partners, and a publishing deal for his upcoming memoir. The network that had signed on to broadcast a post-match documentary pulled out, citing ethical concerns. Even Granite Ridge, his long-standing domain, issued a carefully worded statement about conduct unbecoming the spirit of competition. Carter didn't speak. Not to the cameras. Not to the crowd. He stood behind a wall of handlers, sunglasses hiding eyes that no longer gleamed with certainty. His name, once whispered with reverence across gun clubs and elite forums, now carried the bitter weight of manipulation, and all of it, every shred of control he'd tried to cling to, was unraveling in real time. But Lucille? She didn't flinch. She offered no interview, no post-match celebration. When a reporter rushed up to her asking for a quote about the sabotage, she only replied, "That wasn't my concern," and kept walking. No boast, no gloating, no condemnation. Her victory had never been about exposing Carter. It had always been about standing still while the world tried to shake her. The truth just arrived, on its own. She didn't need to speak it. The crowd had already heard it through every shot she fired. As she moved through the side corridor of the range toward the exit, staff stepped aside without being told. Security didn't question her. Judges nodded respectfully. Veterans who had once been skeptical now looked at her like she was someone they'd always known. And when she reached the parking lot, Shaquille was waiting. Not in front of a crowd. Not for a photo. Just leaning against the same black sedan she'd arrived in. Arms folded, eyes proud, and quiet. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. When she reached him, he opened the passenger door for her and smiled. "Let's go home," he said. She nodded, and they drove away without a police escort, without a parade, just a mother and her son, leaving behind a place that had tried to measure her by the wrong standards. Back inside, Carter watched the live feed go dark. The room around him buzzed with frantic advisors, legal counsel, and a media relations crisis unfolding in real time. He was offered a seat. He declined. The silence in his corner of the room was different than Lucille's had ever been. Hers was power. His was absence. Granite Ridge, once his kingdom, now buzzed with an energy he no longer controlled. People weren't speaking about his titles, his records, or his future. They were speaking about her, the woman who never raised her voice. The woman who didn't belong here, until she did. The woman who didn't come to break records, but to break silence. That night, every major outlet ran the story. But none of them focused on Carter. They focused on the woman who walked into a loaded arena, accepted the worst of someone else's game, and still played it on her own terms. A veteran's widow. A mother. A symbol. And Carter? He faded into a footnote of his own scandal. Because grace isn't loud, but when it walks into a room, it changes everything. Weeks after the storm at Granite Ridge, as headlines shifted and attention found new distractions, something quieter began to rise from Georgia's soil, where most stories fade in the afterglow of victory, or dissolve into controversy. Lucille O'Neal's story didn't end. It evolved. Not with noise, but with nails and blueprints, poured concrete and early morning silence. On the outskirts of Atlanta, nestled between the edge of a long-forgotten pine thicket and an old freight rail line, construction began on a site that looked at first like any other build. But this wasn't just land. This was intention, memory, and reclamation. The Honor and Resilience Range wasn't born of ego, revenge, or spectacle. It was born of something harder to name, something deeper than anger, and older than ambition. It was born of all the years Lucille had watched people like her, black women, veterans' widows, single mothers, and those quietly surviving violence no one talked about, be erased from spaces that demanded posture over purpose. Spaces like Granite Ridge. This new place would not be a mirror of that world. It would be its answer. Lucille didn't hold a press conference when the first foundation was laid. No ribbon-cutting ceremony. Just a handwritten note pinned to the construction board that read, "Honor is not something you carry. It's something you pass on." The money she'd won at the invitational prize funds, anonymous donations that followed, endorsements she never spoke about, was directed here, funneled with surgical precision into a blueprint she'd been sketching for years, long before the first bullet she ever fired at Granite Ridge. The range would include more than firing stations. It would include classrooms for trauma recovery, shared kitchens, on-site childcare, community gardens, and a mechanic shed for teaching repair skills. It wasn't about shooting. It was about centering people who had been pushed to the margins. The name itself, Honor and Resilience, was not a brand but a declaration. Lucille never wanted her name stamped on anything. But her husband's, that was different. Over the main gate, cast in brushed bronze, a single plaque read, "The Elijah Ward Center for Precision and Peace." Below it, in smaller script, "Built for those who stood steady, even when unseen." Construction workers, mostly veterans, volunteered time between contracts. Some were paid in small stipends, others insisted on donating their labor. Many had heard of Lucille through the broadcast, but some had known her through quieter channels, church connections, community food drives, a scholarship she'd once funded anonymously for a young girl with a perfect GPA and no support at home. They didn't come for glory. They came because they recognized something rare, a project not built to impress but to repair. Each week, Lucille visited the site. Not as a forewoman, but as a steward. She wore jeans and an old hoodie, often carried a thermos of tea, and moved through the gravel and steel, like she belonged there, because she did. She knew every corner of the plan, every name of every bricklayer. She shook hands, asked about families, listened when no one else did. People didn't call her ma'am on site. They called her Miss Lucille, like she was theirs, and somehow had always been. As the walls began to rise, word traveled. Veterans groups reached out. Local news covered the build as a footnote to her now legendary competition appearance. But they never fully captured the why behind it. National outlets tried to position it as a redemption arc, an epilogue to her unlikely win. Lucille declined every interview. She wasn't interested in correcting them. The people who needed to understand already did. Among the first confirmed programs at the center was a Marks of Dignity initiative, a free months-long course that taught underserved women, not just marksmanship, but confidence. Classes included breathwork, de-escalation, mental clarity, and technical repair. It was not a gun culture factory. It was about discipline, healing, and clarity under pressure. It was about ensuring that women who had been told they couldn't aim were reminded that they had always held control in their hands. They just hadn't been taught where to point it. Lucille personally helped draft the training protocols. She brought in instructors, some veterans, some retired officers, some survivors of domestic abuse, who had gone on to teach self-defense with grace and strength. None were celebrities. All were people who had lived. She insisted that no one wear uniforms or carry ranks. Everyone addressed each other by first names. One room in the center, tucked beside a sunlit hallway near the garden beds, was marked only by a small wooden sign, the Legacy Room. Inside it, a table stood in the middle, carved from the wood of Lucille's old kitchen table. On it, photographs. Elijah in uniform. Lucille in her early 20s. A faded, blown-up newspaper clipping of Shaq's high school basketball team. Her beaming face in the background. A folded flag. A copy of the letter Shaq had left her before the final match, printed and framed. It read again, "Do what you've always done, Mama. Change the story." Visitors were invited to add to the room. Photos of their loved ones, journal entries, letters unsent. It became a gallery not of mourning, but of lineage. A soft rebellion against being forgotten. By the time the Honor and Resilience Range opened its doors, there was no grand unveiling, just a quiet Saturday morning, sunlight cutting through dew-soaked trees, and a line of women at the gate, some holding their daughters' hands. Lucille stood by the door with a clipboard, smiling gently, as if this was always the plan. Because it was. And somewhere in the background, unannounced, Shaq watched from a distance. He didn't walk through the crowd, or take photos. He stood near the trees, hands tucked into his hoodie pockets, eyes glistening, not from fame, not from pride, but from legacy. Carter Langston didn't show. His name had all but vanished from mainstream circuits. A quiet investigation into other incidents emerged, revealing a pattern of behind-the-scenes manipulation. His empire crumbled inward, but Lucille never once mentioned him again, not even in private. He wasn't part of the legacy she was building. He was just a page in the book she'd turned. The first shot fired on the new range wasn't broadcasted. It wasn't performed. It was taken by a woman in her 50s, who had survived 3 decades of silence and finally learned how to breathe again. Lucille stood beside her, hand on her shoulder. "Take your time," she whispered. The shot hit clean. Not center, not perfect, but strong. And the crowd behind her, veterans, mothers, daughters, neighbors, clapped softly, the kind of applause that doesn't need an announcer. Because here, at the Honor and Resilience Range, every sound meant something. Every aim had a reason. and every silence was earned. Lucille O'Neill stood alone near Lane 6, the very place it had all begun. She had returned not for closure, but for something less defined, something only the quiet could reveal. She wore the same coat, its edges faded, softened by use, her boots pressed into the gravel without a sound. In her hands, a rifle. Not Carter's, not one built for contests or showcases. This one was hers. A simple bolt-action .308. Her husband Elijah had once used to teach her how to feel the breath of a rifle, not fight it. The wood of the stock was worn smooth, not polished, and her fingers curled around it like they had 1,000 times before. No one had known she was coming. Not the staff, not the press, not even Shaq. This visit wasn't planned. It wasn't symbolic. It was personal. The sky above darkened to a deep indigo, pinpricked with stars. A sliver of moonlight touched the ridgeline, casting soft shadows across the empty lanes. Lucille moved slowly to the bench, setting the rifle down with deliberate care. She didn't rush. She didn't check the sight. She didn't need to. She sat for a moment, letting her breath adjust to the quiet. There was no crowd to perform for, no score to beat, no legacy to defend. She had already given the world what it demanded, and more than it deserved. Now this was for her. She stood, lifted the rifle, and stepped to the line. The wind shifted slightly, tugging at the hem of her coat. She glanced toward the farthest target, not to aim but to remember. The mountain air held traces of 1,000 voices, the whispers of the women, who'd trained at honor and resilience, the laughter of veterans gathered over campfires, the steady beat of marching feet from generations long past. But above them all was Elijah's voice, not as words but as presence, a grounding, a promise. Lucille closed her eyes. She thought of every woman who had ever been told she was too old, too quiet, too late. Every girl whose hands had never been taught how to hold precision, because the world was too busy handing her burdens. Every mother who carried strength in silence. Every son who had learned how to be big, without losing how to be gentle. She thought of her son. She thought of herself, and then she opened her eyes. No countdown, no announcement, just one breath, one pull, one shot. The crack of the bullet sliced the twilight clean. No echo chased it. It didn't need one. She lowered the rifle, exhaled, and smiled, not because she'd hit anything. The target didn't matter. The distance didn't matter. The score didn't matter. What mattered was the stillness in her chest, the fullness in her lungs, the feeling of something finishing without needing to end. Lucille walked away from the line without looking back. The gravel crunched beneath her boots. Somewhere in the trees beyond the ridge, an owl stirred. The air was colder now, but not biting, just enough to remind her that this mountain remembered. At the edge of the path she paused and reached into her coat pocket. From it she drew a folded square of paper, a page torn from Elijah's old journal. On it faded ink lines read, "You don't always have to speak to be heard. Sometimes you just have to stand still." She tucked it under a loose stone near the base of the lane. A quiet offering, not a monument, just a message for whoever might find it. And then she left. No farewell, no trace, only footprints and a truth that no amount of commentary could rewrite, that grace, when held with precision, could be sharper than any bullet. In the weeks that followed, rumors circled. A staffer claimed he'd seen her under the trees at dusk. A local boy hiking nearby said he'd heard a single shot echo through the canyon, but no one captured it on camera. No one had proof. And yet the moment took on a life of its own. Young shooters at the Honor and Resilience range began leaving stones at the base of their lanes before their first shots. Not for luck, for grounding. Veterans passed around the story quietly, with reverence, like folklore they didn't need verified to believe. And Granite Ridge, once the citadel of exclusivity, began to change in ways it hadn't expected. Not because rules were rewritten, but because expectations had been shattered. No longer could silence be mistaken for absence. No longer could age be mistaken for rust. No longer could legacy be decided by lineage. Lucille didn't return to the spotlight. She returned to her garden, to her notes, to the soft calls of mothers who needed something more than advice. They needed a model of what power without noise looked like. And sometimes, when the sun dipped low and the wind carried just right, those standing alone on any given range, anywhere across the country, would feel it. That echo, not of a bullet, but of a presence, still steady, undeniable, and true. What if the next legend doesn't walk in loud, but walks in like Lucille? What if strength looks like stillness, And justice sounds like one clear shot through silence. This isn't just a story, it's a signal. Pass it on to someone who's been told they don't belong. Because sometimes, the most powerful aim is knowing exactly when to take your shot.